Hello and welcome to another episode of Historic Hindsight. I'm John, that's Tom, and today we're going to talk to you about the best deal ever made.
That's right. The best deal ever made with the samurai.
Yeah, right?
What's the
They fold
what
it
is
so
it?
many times and it makes
Oh, the
it's
best
the best.
steel.
Yeah,
Steel. Yeah, steel.
yeah.
I heard deal. I'm like, what deal did we make with the samurai? Yeah, the best. Yeah, we are gonna. It is we are now on to our episode 2 of the samurai special. So the golden age of the samurai, which is where most of their myths start to come from.
Ah,
Out of this
I mean that
golden
makes sense.
age.
If it was a golden age, it's when they were the best, right?
The best, yeah, that's the best, and that's
At
when they're
their
at
height
yeah.
of power and prestige and um, probably some sort of criminality, I'm sure. But
Yeah, so yeah,
anyway,
well, yeah, hit the nose on the bum right there. So if you join us for the last episode, or if you're trying to recap from the last episode, after the Mongol invasions of Japan and the fall of the first shogunate era, the Kamakura era, when it came to an end, multiple samurai classes started infighting, and there was even an attempt to reestablish the imperial rule, which didn't work out
they didn't.
super well for the empire, the emperor. Yeah, I mean, he was again, the emperor is always there, but it's how much control does he really have versus...
Is he a power? Is he in power? Is he just a figurehead who's filling a position and getting pug puppies to warm up his feet or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. So after the Kamakura era falls, eventually the Shikaga, I'm going to butcher these names, shogunate takes over between 1336 and 1573. But they never quite have the power of the Kamakura, and several key things happened during this time period, which is where some of the myths during the Golden Age come from. And most notably your folding of steel, Johnny. That's right.
Yeah, to make the swords. Strongest steel, sharpest blade ever created by man. So I think how the legend goes.
How the legend goes. Yeah. So before I shit on everybody's dreams and all the myths and all that crap, I'm going to say that I'm going to paint broad strokes here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to jump over hundreds of years of history just to give an overview.
Yeah, this is not a deep dive into samurai history. This is a brief overview of who the samurai were and where they came from.
So during the Shikaga shogunate, the katana becomes a thing. So before the 1300s, not that the Japanese didn't have swords, but what we know as the katana, with that slightly tapered,
the curved blade and everything,
the slightly curved blade with a single edge, all that stuff. Yeah, that's relatively new. So around 900, the samurai did have a sword, but it was actually just a straight blade, double-edged straight blade sword, very much like the Chinese sword of the time frame.
Yeah. Those Tai Chi swords or whatever with
nothing.
It was very kind of like what you would think of in England too, as far as their broadswords go. English broadswords,
or even
maybe smaller and single-handed.
Yeah, like the Roman, a little bit less thick, but like the Roman, whatever that short.
They're short swords, yeah.
But actually, at this time, the primary weapon of the samurai was the Naginta. Which is basically the Naginta.
Yeah,
check out my Naginta. Yeah,
the League. Yeah, they had a whole episode all about the Naginta.
The Naginta, which is basically a sword put on a spear.
Really
long
cool.
arm,
I mean that. Give me
cool
that if you're gonna put me back in that day.
And that's the primary bladed weapon that they had. The Yumi, which is a longbow, which was the samurai's primary weapon, which we discussed about how that happened with the hairy people back in when the samurai started, and the tanto, which is actually a short double-edged knife. So for the Ashikaga, the primary weapons were not a sword that we think of today with samurai. We think of the katana.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm sure it came down to the way they were battling and what was more practical. If you had a longer handle with a bigger blade on the end of it, you are now in a longer range fight, which is less dangerous. And then if it gets in close, you have to have your dagger for the close stuff.
And with that said, the actual primary sword that was used at this time, which did have a much more pronounced curve, was called an Adachi, which is a very long, double-handed, super long. Like, think of a katana kind of.
It's like steroids. That's like what you see in the anime now, where they have just those huge swords charging down. So yeah, it's like if you gave a regular katana to a, I don't know, like a 5-year-old, have them hold.
So right around the 1300s is when the Japanese swordsmiths discovered the use of folding steel and iron. So basically they take many different levels of steel and realize, all right, look, we don't have the highest quality of steel, but if we take this higher quality steel, mix it with some iron or mix it with some lower quality steel, and then we fold it as we're forging it, and then we fold it over and we do that, which is where the whole like folded 1,000 times, which by the way, that's bullshit in and of itself. It's not actually folded 1,000 times. Yeah. It's compiled. So you have 2 layers of steel. You fold it, now you have 4 layers of steel. Yeah. You fold it, now you have 8 layers of steel. So your 1,000 layer of steel isn't folded.
Exponentially equation there. But yeah, so if the folding though would work out the impurities, right? Is essentially
it would help.
The lesser steel.
It helps. Yeah, it would help work out the impurities, help strengthen the blade. And what you're left with is a metal that's very capable of having a very nice, fine, short, or fine blade, fine, sharp edge. But the blade itself is actually weak. Like
as far as from contact to the sides or whatever. That's why sword fights were not what you see in movies either. Especially in samurai and Asian sword fighting, it was very little contact sword to sword, and they were very short battles. It wasn't like fencing is. It's big cuts and short contact.
Now, to improve the brittleness of steel, if you know anything about forging metal, you gotta quench it some way. You gotta treat the blade, and how they do it is they actually take clay and they put it on the back non-bladed side or not edge side of the blade. Put that clay on it, superheat it, then dunk it when they quench it. That's what gives it that bend.
Yeah, because it causes an uneven cooling, and so the blade that isn't covered in clay cools quicker, and then you get the sucking up into the curve. Yes, and so this started in the 1300s.
This really starts in the 1300s during the Stikigara shogunate. So before then, not saying that the blades didn't exist, but they definitely weren't primary weapon of the samurai, and they definitely weren't. They
weren't emblematic of the samurai and I assume once they started doing that, it became that's what samurais carried, and that's when it became such a recognizable like. Kind of they go hand in hand or no?
Sort of. By the end of the episode, I'll explain how the sword comes in and how the katana gets recognized as the weapon of the samurai. But that's really, this is just where it develops, where it begins.
Okay.
They start having katanas get made. That's all you need to know at this point. So with the Stikigara in the mid 14th century, they start beginning to use the sword. So actually during the whole Mongol invasions, like we talked about during the last one, during that whole time period that the video game Ghost of Tsushima is recognized as, the Ghost of Tsushima would not have really been running around with katanas. He would have been running around with Nagintas, my Naginta.
Which would have been a better video game anyway.
Stabbing people with spears is way better. But in any case, that's myth number 1. Also during this period, Buddhism is introduced into the region, which leads to the myths of honor and the code of Bushido, which, by the way, is actually bullshit. Didn't exist. There is no historical record, written documents to prove that a Bushido code or a specific code with these like 10 commandments exist.
When did when did that start becoming a thing then?
Well, it does. There is general rules of codes for samurai that they kind of sort of follow.
Just a code of conduct.
A code of conduct, sort of. And I use that word sort of because we nowadays think of samurai as a entity, one group of people. But in reality, they are hundreds of different groups of warrior classes that fight for their daimyo. And so...
It's basically having
each little clan has their own. It's like saying that all Native Americans have the same belief structure,
right? Which is what we do in schools. So for those who were raised in the American education system, they very different. The natives were, but it's like when it's kind of like when you watch a kung fu movie and they have all the schools come into the center. And they're all martial arts clubs, but they all have their own unique fighting style, their own kind of rules and ways of behavior and everything. And so it was the same way with the samurai. They were basically just you wore a costume, but aside from that,
it's just armor. It's just
right.
I mean, your costume is just armor.
And it would just depend on who was
there's no
who they were serving.
The only historical text that you get into that kind of sort of people look at as code of Bushidos aren't really like codes of Bushidos. They're
I think Bushido, isn't it? No,
Bushido or whatever. They're legends. It's not like the chivalric codes or chivalry that we had in Europe, where there actually were like
you can find or whatever.
You can find the chivalric code. You can find those rules, those guidelines, those codes actually written down on period documents. You can't find that for Bushido or whatever you're actually supposed to pronounce it as. So, but a lot of that's to blame because of Buddhism and how the religion of Buddhism works. It starts to come into play, and there is some of that whole honor ideology that starts to get drawn in, but it's romanticized more than what it really is. Because at the end of it, the core thing about samurai is they are a mercenary class of people. Yes, they are a military class. It exists within the Japanese culture, a specific class in that structure. But at the end of the day, they're mercenaries.
Yeah.
So who's ever paying them kind of leads the way.
They're in charge and they make the rules, and then they're the samurai are there to help enforce it in their little lordshipdom, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
City square block, states, whatever.
Feudals. Yep. So with all that said, with crushing your dreams during the Ashikaga shogunate, the shogunate didn't have as much control over the individual daimyos, leading to a feud between the Hosokawa and the Yamana clans in 1467 over Kyoto. So Kyoto, Japan, kind of towards the capital at that time. You've got these two big samurai clans that are fighting. This civil war, which begins the whole Onan War, leads to a complete loss of control in the region, splintering Japan basically into several hundred feudal domains ruled by several hundred different daimyos. And this is the background of the very awesome game Shogun Total War. So if you ever played that game, it's the very first game of the whole Total War series. This is the background. It takes place in the 1400s after the emperor has no real control and the samurai have split into several hundred different states.
So it's like if Indiana or any state really just broke up into their counties and said we're all our own individual and we're fighting everybody else is kind of what happened.
Yeah,
just small
and
sections.
And it begins the dawn of the golden age of the samurai because, well, the samurai are super important.
A lot of fighting.
100 different nations fighting each other.
They need somebody who's going to come and fight, right? And so who better?
Yeah, and it's where all the heart of the samurai myths come from. But again, realize I said hundreds of clans, so any myth about samurai is completely and total bullshit because there's not samurai.
There's a samurai.
Clans. Yeah, there's clans. Now, honor was common among a lot of the clans that did exist during this time period. For instance, during this time period, there was a romanticized war, and I use that term very, very loosely, between the Shugi Kenshin and the Takaga Shingen, butchering names, but you basically have these two powerful clans that are fighting. And again, I use that term very loosely because it's more of a Super Bowl, a sporting event, than it really is a war. They meet up at the same location, the same time, every year, once a year, to have a big battle. And it doesn't matter who wins or loses. It's not like whoever wins gets the other clan's land. No, it's just they meet up every year. And
so it's a symbolic sport, basically, to battle, to have this battle. It's just an event. So
it's an event that takes place yearly. Yeah.
But that's it. And in between, they're totally just
they're just like
existing, coexisting as whatever,
coexisting as normal. In fact, Shingen, Takada Shingen, he gets his salt supply destroyed by another rival clan before his big yearly battle with Kenshin.
Yeah.
And instead of just like taking advantage of that, Kenshin sends him a shit ton of salt and says, "Look, allegedly the famous quote is, 'I fight with swords, not salt.'" But
pretty good quote.
It's
probably didn't say it.
Probably didn't say it. Definitely not in English.
I probably just said, "Hey, here's some salt. I heard you needed it."
And so it's stories like that where you get the whole myth of honor. Like, I will not fight dishonorably. I won't. Like the whole Ghost of Tsushima is, you cannot dishonor the shogunate, and you must fight with honor. You can't poison your enemies. You can't betray your enemies. Okay.
No, but what about Harikari, all of that? Wasn't that a
yes, that was
samurai
a
thing, or the samurai at least were supposed to do it if they
yes
surrendered or whatever. It was better to
So where that actually comes from, and it was a thing, it did exist.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know that was real.
Seppaku. But it's not like what we're taught in the movies and what we're taught in the Western ideology, where like if Japan lost, if the samurai lost any battle, they had to commit seppuku. It's not that. That's not it at all. In fact, samurai retreated quite a bit. Like,
I mean, that's
fight
good.
Another day.
That's just good tactics. Yeah.
Where it does come from is if they are captured in battle and they are going to be executed. If they are executed, their family is not entitled to any of the land property that particular person owned. So a way to ensure that they do have their land is if they, Johnny, I don't make the rules. I'm just telling you what it is. That's the culture.
No, we need to do a deep dive into feudal Japanese law, please.
I didn't do a deep dive into that. But if they're executed, they can't pass their inheritance on down to their heirs. But if they commit seppuku, if they kill themselves, it's okay. The honor's intact, and the property inheritance can get transferred down. So that's why they did it, not because like their honor was hurt or they lost the battle or
they retreated
or anything like that. It was just, if you're going to be executed, that's the way to ensure that
better to kill yourself than to be killed, I guess.
No, with those lovely honorable stories, you have the dishonorable, backstabbing, typical things you think of when you're a human mercenary, where you just go to the highest bidder.
Yeah,
one of these is famous during the Obudenaga. He was trying to unify Japan during this period to make Japan one nation again under one samurai shogunate rule. And one of his loyal generals, and I use that term very, very loosely, Akitsi Mishuda. Akitsi Mishuda. We'll go with that. He actually claims the title of shogun for himself, backstabs Obunaga, and that's the end of Obunaga rule to try to
literally backstabs him, or
it turns on him, and then of course Michuda, he's gonna be backstabbed himself and killed by one of his allies for betraying. So it's all that kind of crap. But I say this story because that kind of leads into probably the most famous betrayal, which the Obunaga one leads into this one, is during the Battle of Stikigara, where several samurai clans under Ishida Mitsunura, who is the Tokugawa shogunate, or he's going to become a shogunate, who's trying to take over Japan himself after the whole Obunaga got backstab thing. He's fighting the Toyotomi coalition. And right before the Toyotomi coalition, the battle begins, several of Ishida Mitsunura's clans abandon Toyotomi and side with Tokugawa. And then even during the battle, the ones that are remaining go, looks like Tokugawa's going to win. So time to switch sides, which leads to Tokugawa winning, which leads to the Tokugawa shogunate, which leads to actually Japan being unified and that whole split 100 clans being dissolved. And you get to the point where
they pick the right side.
Like all of a sudden there's a power vacuum and there's peace in Japan, and now we don't need all the samurai fighting all the time.
Well, so what are all of these hired murderers gonna do then? I mean,
exactly.
They could be the police.
So two big key things happened during this time period with the Great Peace. So right before the Great Peace, you have a Portuguese trader who smuggles into Japan on a Chinese ship. He smuggles in the first arquebuses, which are the early matchlock muskets that enter into Japan. And these early guns, they, unlike the movie Last Samurai, the samurai take to the guns. It's not like, we can't use this firearm.
This dishonorable thing.
I'm not saying there aren't clans out there that didn't use them, but the vast majority of clans went, that's beneficial.
That kills people real good. And
it goes
pretty far away,
straight through the armor. Yeah,
that's pretty
great.
Hell
of a lot less time to train them on that too than other weapons forms.
Then having to master Japanese weaponry in such a way to become proficient. Yeah, that's a little easier to just say point it that way and shoot it.
Yeah, the early clans that didn't adopt the firearms actually didn't adopt them because they didn't think it was dishonorable, but because they thought the Yumi was a better weapon because they could get more shots off. If you're good at archery, a bow is a hell of a lot more accurate over a longer distance than a smoothbore matchlock musket.
Yeah, back in that day,
a lot more rounds,
and you go quickly with
faster.
Now,
with
trouble
that,
is,
with it said, it takes a lifetime to learn
yeah,
how to use a longbow appropriately,
yeah,
and it takes any peasant about 5 minutes to learn how to use a matchlock.
yeah,
Like,
and you just line up
give
enough
me,
peasants, and I don't care how many arrows you have, you're gonna run
yeah,
out.
yeah, you gotta run out and give me an afternoon with you, Johnny, and I can guarantee you I can make you proficient enough with a matchlock to be able to kill a samurai.
You could make me a lot better with a matchlock than any archer in the world could make me with a bow and arrow in a day.
In a day, yes, very
Guaranteed.
much so. Very much so. Which these muskets also did get into the Tokugawa's hands, which really kind of helped solidify them taking over
Yeah,
all of Japan. Now, after the whole traitors' victories, everything's done. Tokugawa has his united Japan. The peace happens. The samurai are left to go, well, what do we do now? And you have the daimyos who are going, well, I'm paying you, so
you're gonna do something.
what am I paying you for if not for military protection that we don't need anymore? So the samurai are left with basically several options. The first is they can become ronin, which is a nice way of saying brigand. Basically, it means that they have no daimyo, they're on their own, and they're going to do whatever it means necessary to make a buck, which usually means turning into some kind of criminal of sorts.
Or working for a criminal.
Or working for a criminal.
If they're not directly. So they just Ronin's just mercenary. It's just
it's a mercenary without a boss. Yeah, it's a mercenary without a boss. The other options they could do is that they can that they found their work within the police force of the local daimyos. They could become a police state for them. They became clerks in storehouses. They became night watchmen, tax collectors, various different administration positions. The whole term civil servant basically comes from samurai and to serve, and that really takes on a new meaning in a different way as opposed to being serving as a military strength. You're serving now as serving your politician community. And bureaucrat.
You serve your community. Bureaucrat. So that's nice.
So as they transition from a military force into more of a bureaucratic force, they begin finding other things to do with their time. So while maintaining their armor was a part of their whole, like, we maintain our military force, the whole military training thing starts to taper off as a side point. But they are a class that is above farmers, or class above peasants. There's 12 social classes in Japan, and samurai sit in about the middle. So they're not going to want to show themselves as lower than what they are. So symbols start to come about. Armor is a great symbol. I am samurai. This is my armor.
Makes it pretty recognizable.
You're not going to wear a full plate of armor into, tax collecting.
I mean, you
might not. You could, but it's not common. That shit's heavy. I don't want to walk around with that
too often.
I don't want to be sitting at a desk
cumbersome
counting money
with the deck.
So what does become the symbol of the samurai is the katana, and you have the samurai who now, with their disposable income, not having to buy armor, not having to really buy much weaponry for actual fighting, start to spend more and more of that disposable income on more and more ornate katanas,
probably getting their dope dragon head sculpted into that. If you look at that, this is from Japan. But carved in 100%. Bone. Definitely not a $5 flea market katana. Don't be ridiculous. I would not have that.
So this is where the super ornate, super valuable katanas that we know of today come from during this time period.
The decorative ones,
in Japan, because they're not weapons. They're decorative. I mean, they'll function as weapons, but
sure. But it's no different than lords and everything getting their sabers real ornate, or their flintlock guns or whatever, getting all the handle carvings and everything. It's
like dictators now with the gold-plated AKs.
Yeah, it's
you're not going to war with the gold-plated AK.
No, but you have one, and if you had to use it, sure, it would work for a bit.
And that's where we get the whole idea that the katana represents the samurai, because that's exactly what happened.
They made it represent it, essentially. They said, this is us katana, and this is our thing. And
the bureaucrat walking around with a katana is samurai. That's all it boils down to. Now,
so it was like a bunch of martial arts black belts today just walking around with their black belts on to whatever job they go to. They would just be like, oh yeah, I know I'm an accountant, but also black belt.
And that's kind of where the golden age of the samurai ends. They start off as this elite warrior class that's necessary because the entire nation split within 100 different ways and, you know, hundreds of years of warfare. But by 1600, things calm down and peace starts to reign, and then they get bored and have to do something, so they work as administrators and bureaucrats, and the sword becomes a decorative piece of their culture, and they long for this day when their military meant something and they were desirable for something other than counting pennies.
Well, and no doubt that's when they start beefing up their history too, and building up the legend and lore of what a samurai was, and who, you know, because that's their lineage, that's their line.
That's their line.
They could trace their training back to a samurai who was fighting in those wars hundreds of years ago or whatever.
It is also at the time where the whole military training starts to take a back. Like, they used to train hours and hours and hours every day because it was a necessary thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now that transitions more into etiquette, politeness, politics. They start training about how to be a politician as opposed to being a warrior, because that's really what they've more become. And that's what they're getting paid to do with those more administrative roles. And with that, the military tracks that they do start to take over isn't actual like fighting as much as it is symbolic. So you get the whole art form of kendo, which is what we know today, that very ornate sword fighting duelist style, which you see in Ghost of Tsushima, but isn't real. That's not real fighting. You wouldn't actually fight a battle with kendo. It's an art form. It'd be fighting a sword fight. It's like fencing.
It's a sport.
You're not going to actually get into a sword fight with a fencing style. That's not practical from a military application. It's practical from a sport, which is what kendo is. It's a sport.
That's all of the martial arts that end in do are sport-based martial arts. They're competition. That's the taekwondo, your kempo, your judo, and then like jujitsu and everything else is more of like a lifestyle study of it. They don't have they don't go to tournaments and win trophies and stuff. But the does are their actual sports. That's why they've been in Olympics and stuff. It's a game that you play.
Yes.
Not that they can't fight, but it's also they're playing a game. They're not training to actually engage in combat.
Because again, remember, kendo gets developed not during the golden age of the samurai. It's not the end
afterwards when they were bored and they needed something to do. They're like, we need a game to play on Saturday afternoon after we've finished our weeks of pushing papers and
1600. It's 1600s. Nobody in warfare is getting into ornate sword battles in the 1600s. No. You got guns. Arquebuses are well out and about now. In fact, you've got the flintlocks that have now come onto the scene, which are even more reliable than the matchlocks. You've got rifling, which is prominent on the scene.
Yeah, any of the sword fights you're seeing now are just actual bayonet fights when people ran out of ammo. That's about the only bladed fights you're seeing.
And over the next several hundred years, we're going to end it here. But in our next series of episodes on the samurai was the fall of the samurai and why guns kind of led to that, because you don't really need armored knights when a gun's around. It's kind of the same thing that happened with our knights. You don't really need them when guns are around. But we get into the actual, like, where did the code of Bushido, what we know of as the code of Bushido, come from? And we'll get into why the samurai fell and how all those implications of taking the samurai and glorifying them up to a pedestal kind of made Imperial Japan during World War II what it was. So stay tuned for next time.
That's it for this week in Historic Hindsight. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review, and join us next week when we talk about Mount Rushmore.